My name is Gabrielle Centenari, and one of my favorite poems that we've read this year is America by Claude McKay. I think this is one of my favorites because when I read it, I always think of my mom and the story of her family's eventual escape from Egypt and their early life in America around 1963. My mom was born in Egypt and lived there with her brother and her parents for most of her childhood for around 7 years. Her father was a very well known and respected doctor in Egypt, and they lived a safe and comfortable life there until around the mid 1950s when a man named Gamal Abdel Nasser came to power. During this time, everything began to change, and Nasser started imposing rules and restrictions, and daily freedoms began being taken away under this power, including and especially religious freedom. My mom remembers that her and her brother went to a Catholic school, and within the first few weeks, all the crosses were taken off the walls at her school and replaced with pictures of Nasser. My grandparents became increasingly anxious of what was to come of the country and the future of their children, especially my grandfather, who we called Poppy. Poppy wanted to move to America where his brother had already moved and started a new life. But as a doctor, he wasn't allowed to leave the country under Nasser's power. But he knew he needed to get out of Egypt, and he knew he needed to get his family to a safe place. So he told them to pack a bag each, and they all went to the airport. And at the airport, Poppy told the soldiers that they were just visiting family in America and that they'd be back in a few weeks because obviously he wasn't allowed to leave. But the soldiers did not believe him, and um, and so he handed their house key to the soldiers, their house key with all of their belongings back in Egypt. They each had one bag each at the airport, so everything else was left in their house. And Poppy told the soldier that he would be back to claim the house key because he needed all of their possessions. So they left, and that was the last time they saw those soldiers and the key and even Egypt, because they arrived in America and knew that they were there to stay. But life in America was not easy. It was really hard, actually. Poppy and the family moved to a small apartment outside of Boston that his brother had rented for them. And it was winter when they got there, and it was brutally cold and snowing, which they'd never seen snow before in Egypt and never experienced weather that cold. So I remember seeing pictures of my mom and her family, and my grandmother, my mom's mom, looked very, very unhappy in all these pictures standing in the snow. And my mom remembers that her mother was having a very difficult time with the move. She was unhappy a lot and crying and shaking her head at Poppy, asking why they had done what they did, leaving their entire lives behind them. And my grandmother and my mom and my uncle did not speak a word of English, and Poppy spoke very little. And Poppy didn't even have a job when he got there. Um, and a lot of people in America weren't as friendly and welcoming like as they'd hoped, especially during this time, the 1960s. But despite all of this, they were still free, and my mom remembers Poppy always reminding them this. They were still free. When I first read the poem America, I automatically thought of this amazing story behind my mom's move to America and their first few years there, and also the story behind my existence and the life I have today. Many of McKay's poems comment on the intense racial issues during the early 1900s and how cruelly African Americans were treated. And it was the 1960s when my mom and her family got to America, and racial tension was obviously at an all-time high during this time. Not just towards African Americans, but to a lot of minority groups, including immigrants, especially those from the Middle East and Africa. And every day their patience was tested by these stereotypes that they face every day, and they needed to it took a long time to adjust to this Western culture and to this country that was in basically turmoil during this time. But despite all these hardships that they faced, they knew America promised freedom, which they did not, which they were quickly losing in Egypt. And the poem America by Claude McKay describes the harshness and pain that the country has inflicted upon the speaker, but somewhere out, but somewhere through all this pain, the speaker is able to find courage and hope, and to see that this deeper part of America provides this freedom that doesn't compare to any other place in the world. And whenever my family travels somewhere out of the country and need our passports, I see my mom firmly holding on to all of the passports just out of pride and gratefulness that she's able to call this country her home. And despite the violence and discrimination that is always going to be part of the history of America, there'll always be what McKay refers to as priceless treasures sinking in the sand, which is my favorite part of the poem. And this is America by Claude McKay. Although she feeds me bread of bitterness, and sinks into my throat her tiger's tooth, stealing my breath of life, one will confess. I love this cultured hell that tests my youth. Her vigor flows like tides into my blood, giving me strength erect against her hate. Her bigness sweeps my being like a flood, yet as a rebel fronts a king in state. I stand within her walls with not a shred of terror, malice, not a word of jeer. Darkly I gaze into the days ahead, and see her might and granite wonders there. Beneath the touch of time's unerring hand, like priceless treasures sinking in the sand.